You clicked on this video because you want to know what kind of person stays behind when everyone else is being told to run for the boats, and by the end of this story you will understand exactly why one army nurse in the Philippines chose the jungle, the wounded, and almost certain capture over a guaranteed seat on the last transport out. This is a true story pulled from one of the darkest chapters in American military history, the fall of Bataan in early 1942, and none of it needs exaggeration to feel unbelievable, because the real details are already extraordinary enough on their own. In the opening weeks of the Pacific War, thousands of American and Filipino soldiers found themselves trapped on a narrow, mountainous peninsula west of Manila Bay, cut off from resupply, cut off from reinforcement, and slowly running out of food, ammunition, and time while a determined Japanese army pressed in from multiple directions at once. Inside that shrinking, collapsing pocket of jungle and volcanic rock, a small unit of Army and Navy nurses ran field hospitals that had no real walls, no proper beds, and thousands of patients lying under bamboo frames and canvas tarps stretched between the trees. One of those nurses was Second Lieutenant Hattie Brantley, a young woman from Jefferson, Texas, who had already made up her mind, long before anyone forced her to decide, that she was not leaving her patients behind no matter what came next, and that decision would define the next 3 years of her life in ways she could not possibly have predicted the day she made it. Before we go any further into what happened to her and to the women who served beside her, I want to ask you for something directly, because stories like this one do not survive on their own. If accounts of real people making extraordinary choices under real pressure matter to you, subscribe to this channel right now so you do not miss the next one, tap the like button so more people outside this small circle discover this history, and share this video with someone in your life who needs to hear what genuine courage looked like long before cameras or social media existed to record it. Stories like Hattie Brantley's are slipping out of public memory simply because fewer people are alive to tell them firsthand, and every share genuinely helps keep that from happening. With that said, let's go back to December 1941, because to understand why a hospital existed in a jungle in the first place, you have to understand exactly how fast everything in the Philippines fell apart, and how little warning anyone actually had before their entire world changed within a matter of hours. Japan attacked the Philippines on December 8, 1941, just hours after the strike on Pearl Harbor, catching American air power on the island still parked on the ground and destroying much of it before it ever left the runway. Within days, Japanese troops began landing at multiple points along the Philippine coastline, and American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur found themselves badly outnumbered and rapidly losing ground across the main island of Luzon. Rather than attempt to hold Manila, which had already been declared an open city to spare it from destruction, MacArthur ordered a general withdrawal onto the Bataan Peninsula, a rugged mountainous strip of jungle terrain that could, in theory, be defended for months if properly supplied. The plan called for a war reserve of food and ammunition to be prepositioned there for exactly this scenario, but the retreat happened faster than logistics could keep up with, and by the time the last units crossed into Bataan in early January 1942, the promised stockpiles were nowhere near sufficient for the number of men now crowded onto the peninsula. Soldiers were placed on half rations within the first few weeks of the siege, and by February those rations had been cut again, leaving men fighting a modern war on a diet that left them constantly hungry, increasingly weak, and steadily more vulnerable to tropical disease. They began calling themselves, half in bitter humor and half in genuine fury, the battling bastards of Bataan, a phrase that stuck because it captured exactly how abandoned they felt, cut off from the rest of the war and largely forgotten by a public back home still absorbing the shock of Pearl Harbor. Inside that trap, 2 field hospitals were carved directly out of the surrounding jungle, designated simply Hospital No. 1 and Hospital No. 2, and neither one resembled anything like a conventional medical facility. There were no solid buildings, no real roofs beyond the natural jungle canopy overhead, because any obvious structure would have made an easy target for Japanese aircraft flying reconnaissance and bombing runs over the peninsula. Patients were laid out on cots and stretchers arranged in long rows beneath the trees, and as the siege wore on, malaria and dysentery began spreading through the camp almost as fast as combat wounds were coming in from the front lines. By the height of the fighting, thousands of sick and wounded men were packed into hospital space that had originally been designed to hold a small fraction of that number, and the nurses assigned to those wards worked shifts that stretched far beyond anything reasonable, because there was simply no one else available to take their place. Hattie Brantley was one of those nurses, and she worked those overcrowded wards nearly around the clock, changing dressings by lamplight when generators failed, assisting in makeshift operating areas, and comforting frightened young soldiers who often understood, better than anyone wanted to admit out loud, exactly how bad their chances of survival really were. Hattie had trained as a nurse in Texas well before the war reached the Philippines, and like most of the women serving alongside her, Nothing in that training had prepared her for performing surgery by flashlight, while artillery fire shook the instrument trays hard enough to rattle them off the tables. The nurses stationed on Bataan came from small towns and cities across the United States, many of them barely into their 20s, and almost none of them had any real combat experience before finding themselves running triage lines under enemy bombardment. They sterilized instruments in boiling water over open fires because proper sterilization equipment either did not exist in the field or had broken down weeks earlier, and they stretched medical supplies far beyond what any peacetime hospital would have considered safe or acceptable, simply because there was no alternative available to them. Despite these conditions, mortality rates in the jungle hospitals remained lower than military planners had feared, largely because of the sheer determination of the nursing staff to keep functioning no matter how dire the surrounding military situation became. Hattie later described the work not as heroic in the moment, but simply as the job in front of her, one patient and one decision at a time, an attitude shared by nearly every nurse serving on that peninsula during those final desperate weeks before the fall. As January turned into February, and February slowly gave way to March, conditions on Bataan continued to deteriorate in almost every measurable way, and everyone stationed there, nurses included, understood that surrender was becoming less a question of whether it would happen and more a question of exactly when. Word eventually came down through the chain of command that certain personnel, including a limited number of nurses, would be evacuated by boat or by one of the few remaining aircraft still able to reach the peninsula, first to the fortified island of Corregidor in Manila Bay, and from there potentially further south, out of the combat zone entirely. For many of the nurses serving in those jungle hospitals, this represented a genuine and difficult choice rather than a simple order to be followed without question, because trained medical personnel were considered scarce and valuable enough that commanders were willing to prioritize evacuating them ahead of the general collapse whenever space allowed. Hattie Brantley, along with a significant number of her fellow nurses, made clear through their actions that they intended to remain with their patients for as long as they were needed there, and multiple nurses on record declined or delayed early evacuation opportunities specifically because wounded and sick men in their care still depended on them for basic survival needs that no one else on the peninsula was prepared to provide. The reasoning behind that decision, when the surviving nurses described it decades later in interviews and oral histories, was neither romantic nor complicated in the way Hollywood might later portray it. These women had spent weeks, in many cases months, learning the names, the injuries, and the specific fears of the men lying in their wards, and walking away before those patients were stabilized, transferred, or at minimum properly accounted for felt to them like a betrayal they were simply not willing to commit, regardless of the personal danger that staying behind might eventually bring. Chief Nurse Lieutenant Colonel Maud Davison, 57 years old at the time and already a veteran of nursing service dating back to the First World War, maintained strict discipline and procedural order inside those jungle hospitals even as the sound of artillery fire grew steadily closer with each passing week. The nurses serving under her command, Hattie among them, continued running triage lines, continued boiling instruments in improvised sterilizers, and continued reassuring frightened young soldiers, some barely out of high school, that they would be properly cared for, even in moments when the nurses themselves had no real certainty that promise could actually be kept given how quickly the military situation around them was collapsing. We are now roughly at the halfway point of the story, and before we continue into what happened next to Hattie and the other nurses following the surrender, I want to pause for a moment and ask something of you directly. If this kind of carefully researched, real history matters to you the way it matters to me, please take a few seconds right now to like this video so it reaches a wider audience. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already so you never miss a story like this one, and leave a comment below telling me what has surprised you the most so far, because those comments genuinely shape which stories I choose to research and tell next. On April 9, 1942, after months of steadily worsening conditions and no realistic hope of relief, American and Filipino forces on Bataan formally surrendered to the Japanese, marking what remains, to this day, the single largest surrender of American military personnel in the nation's history. The roughly 75,000 men taken prisoner that day were forced onto what became known afterward as the Bataan Death March, a brutal, forced trek of roughly 60 miles under conditions so severe that historians estimate thousands of prisoners died along the route before ever reaching a permanent camp, from exhaustion, disease, starvation, and outright violence at the hands of their captors. Most of the nurses, including Hattie Brantley, had already been evacuated off the peninsula to Corregidor in the final days before that surrender, ordered off not because they personally wanted to leave their patients behind, but because military command had determined that their medical skills would be more valuable kept alive and functioning elsewhere than lost entirely in the final collapse of the peninsula's defenses. On Corregidor, inside a fortified underground complex known as the Malinta Tunnel, dug directly into solid rock and originally designed as a bomb-proof storage and command facility, the same group of nurses immediately resumed the exact kind of work they had been doing in the jungle only days earlier, treating a fresh and continuous wave of wounded soldiers while Japanese artillery shelled the small island relentlessly from positions on the nearby mainland. The tunnel hospital operated under conditions that were, in some ways, even more difficult than the open-air wards on Bataan had been, with stale, recycled air circulating through narrow passageways, generator-powered lighting that flickered constantly and occasionally failed entirely, and an ever-growing number of patients arriving from a garrison that everyone inside already understood was fighting a battle it could not realistically win. Despite all of this, Hattie and her fellow nurses continued their rounds without interruption, moving between rows of cots carved into rock corridors, performing the same basic acts of care that had defined their service since the earliest days of the war. That underground hospital inside Malinta Tunnel held out for almost a full month longer than Bataan itself had managed to survive, a testament both to the island's heavy fortifications and to the sheer determination of everyone still fighting and working inside it. Nurses treated burns, shrapnel wounds, and the mounting psychological toll on men who had already survived one military collapse only to find themselves trapped inside a second one with even fewer options for escape. Food and medical supplies grew increasingly scarce as the siege dragged on through April and into early May 1942, and communication with the outside world became almost entirely one-directional, with defenders on Corregidor receiving little more than occasional coded messages confirming that no meaningful relief was coming from anywhere in the Pacific. By early May, with the island's coastal defenses largely destroyed and Japanese forces preparing an amphibious assault that the remaining garrison had no realistic way to repel, General Jonathan Wainwright, who had assumed overall command of American forces in the Philippines after MacArthur's earlier departure to Australia, made the difficult decision to formally surrender Corregidor, effectively ending organized American resistance throughout the islands. For the nurses who had refused to leave their patients back on Bataan and had then continued working straight through the subsequent siege of Corregidor without pause, this surrender did not mean the end of their service in any practical sense. It simply meant that their service was about to continue under an entirely different and far more dangerous set of circumstances, as prisoners of war themselves. The captured nurses, roughly 100 Army and Navy women in total, were eventually transported to Manila and interned at Santo Tomas, a university campus that Japanese occupation authorities had converted into a large civilian internment camp for foreign nationals, with some nurses later transferred to a second camp at Los Baños further to the south. Conditions inside both camps were difficult from the very beginning of internment and grew steadily worse as the war dragged on for years rather than the months many internees had initially hoped for, with food rations shrinking progressively until, by late 1944, camp residents were surviving on what amounted to a few hundred calories a day, supplementing meager official rations with boiled weeds, garden scraps, and whatever else could be scavenged from the grounds. Despite these deteriorating conditions, the interned nurses organized themselves almost immediately into a functioning medical unit operating within the camp itself, treating fellow internees for malnutrition, dysentery, and various tropical diseases using almost no formal medical supplies, relying instead on cloth strips torn from old clothing for bandages and boiled water for sterilization because virtually nothing else was available to them inside the camp's restricted supply system. Hattie Brantley worked in that improvised camp hospital for the entire length of her captivity, applying the same discipline and personal care she had first demonstrated in the jungle hospitals of Bataan years earlier, except that now she herself was slowly starving alongside the very patients she continued to treat every single day. What makes this particular chapter of the story so remarkable is not simply that these women managed to survive nearly 3 years of internment, but that they kept functioning as trained nurses throughout the entire ordeal, refusing to let years of captivity strip away the sense of purpose and professional identity that had originally brought them to the Philippines in the first place. Camp guards restricted movement, monitored internee communication, and controlled food distribution as a matter of official occupation policy, and by the final months before liberation, some camp administrators privately acknowledged growing concern that the weakest internees, many of them children and elderly civilians rather than military personnel, would not survive much longer without some form of outside intervention. Historical accounts from Santo Tomas describe internees losing dangerous amounts of body weight over the final year of the war, developing visible edema from prolonged starvation, and struggling to perform even basic daily tasks that had once been effortless, and yet the nurses continued their rounds throughout, checking on the sick, the elderly, and the children held alongside them in the same crowded camp, because that had always been the job they originally signed up for, long before any of them could have imagined it would eventually include surviving a siege of their own, making no military decisions and holding no weapons. Liberation finally came in early 1945, as American forces pushed back into the Philippines faster than either side had realistically expected given the pace of fighting elsewhere in the Pacific theater. On February 3, 1945, the United States Army's 1st Cavalry Division launched a rapid, lightly armored advance directly into Manila, reaching the gates of Santo Tomas that same night and freeing the internees held there, including Hattie Brantley and the majority of the surviving Bataan and Corregidor nurses. Just weeks before conditions inside the camp would very likely have turned fatal for a significant portion of the remaining internees. Soldiers who arrived that night later described internees so severely thin and physically weakened that some could barely stand upright long enough to properly celebrate their own freedom, and yet, according to multiple first-hand accounts, the nurses who had just survived nearly 3 years of captivity were already asking about available medical supplies and already identifying which among the newly freed prisoners needed urgent care first, because 3 years of imprisonment had done remarkably little to change who they fundamentally were as professionals and as people. Weeks later, on February 23, 1945, a separate and carefully coordinated raid freed the remaining internees still held at the Los Baños camp, an operation still studied by military historians today for its precision and its timing, executed just as camp guards were reportedly preparing final measures against the internees rather than allow them to fall into advancing American hands. Every single Army and Navy nurse who had originally been captured on Bataan and Corregidor ultimately survived the war and returned home safely, a fact that genuinely stunned military planners at the time, given the significantly higher death rates recorded among other groups of prisoners held under comparable conditions elsewhere across the Pacific theater. These women, 66 Army nurses and 11 Navy nurses in total, became known afterward as the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor, and each one, including Hattie Brantley, was subsequently awarded the Bronze Star Medal for her service, recognition that only arrived publicly once the full scope of what these nurses had endured over nearly 3.5 years became widely known to the American public. Hattie returned home to Texas after the war concluded, eventually continuing her nursing career for decades afterward and living well into old age as one of the last surviving voices able to describe firsthand exactly what it meant to choose your patients over your own certain safety in the middle of a rapidly collapsing war zone. She rarely described herself as a hero in later interviews, insisting instead, consistently and without exaggeration, that she and the other nurses had simply done the job directly in front of them, one dressing change, one triage decision, and one exhausted overnight shift at a time, refusing again and again to leave until leaving was genuinely no longer a choice anyone was giving them. That repeated refusal, sustained across weeks in a jungle hospital and then years inside an internment camp, is the complete answer to the question this video opened with, because real heroism here never looked like a single dramatic cinematic moment. It looked instead like showing up for the same impossibly difficult job every single day and never once walking away from the people who needed her the most. And if this story genuinely moved you, subscribe to this channel right now, hit like so more people can find it, share it with someone who deserves to hear a true story about quiet, sustained courage, and leave a comment telling me what part of Hattie Brantley's story you did not know before today, because that response is exactly what tells me which piece of real history deserves to be told next.